Okay, let's dive into one of the really big ideas, justice. It shapes, well, pretty much everything about how we organize ourselves, right?
It absolutely does. It's fundamental. We're talking about how we treat each other, how we distribute things, rights, duties, benefits, even punishment.
Yeah, fairness, basically. Getting what you're due. I saw that old Roman quote you included from Ulpian.
Ah, yes. Justice is the constant and perpetual will to render to each his due.
That phrase, to each his due, feels like the anchor point, doesn't it? Even if nobody agrees on what due actually means.
Exactly. That's where all the debate starts, and why justice is, well, probably the most fought-over idea in political thought.
Is it like this perfect ideal, Plato's thing? Or more practical, like Amartya Sen suggests, just trying to fix the injustices we actually see?
That's a key tension right there. The ideal versus the real. Are we building the perfect system or just making things, less unfair step by step?
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack those different angles using the sources you shared.
Precisely. We'll look at social justice first, the big picture. Then we'll get into distributive versus retributive justice. Who gets what and what happens when someone does wrong.
And how it all connects to freedom and equality, which always seem to be in tension.
Definitely. Plus, we have to touch on some big critiques, like Hayek's view and whether justice is even objective, all based on the material we have.
Okay, it sounds like a plan. Let's start with social justice. What does that term really cover?
Broadly, it's about the fairness of the whole societal setup, the institutions, the laws, the background conditions.
So not just individual actions, but the system itself.
Exactly. Is the system fair to everyone, regardless of, say, race, gender, class? Does it give everyone equitable treatment and status?
Okay. Then it's often seen as a type of distributive justice, like how society shares things out.
Yeah, but on a macro level, how are wealth, opportunities, healthcare, education, even political power distributed across the whole society?
The sources mention things like minimal poverty, access to education, and healthcare for all.
Right. Non-discriminatory laws, equal opportunity, making sure all groups can actually participate. That's why social justice movements focus on big systemic issues, economic inequality, racism, gender bias.
Now this is where it gets spicy. Friedrich Hayek. The sources really highlight his criticism.
Oh, absolutely. He famously called social justice a mirage, an empty phrase.
A mirage. Why so dismissive?
Well, his core argument was that society isn't a person. It doesn't intend outcomes. In a free market, the distribution of wealth just sort of happens. It emerges from countless individual actions.
So you can't call an unintended outcome unjust because no one designed it to be that way.
That's his point. Applying justice, a moral term for intentional acts, to an impersonal process is, for Hayek, a category mistake. And he thought attempts to impose a specific pattern of distribution in the name of social justice inevitably required government coercion that crushed individual freedom.
A powerful challenge. How do the counter-arguments in the sources push back?
They basically say, okay, maybe the market outcome is spontaneous, but the rules of the market, the laws, the institutions like tax systems or welfare programs are designed by humans.
So we can judge the fairness of the rules we create, even if we don't control the final outcome perfectly.
Exactly. We can ask if our institutions are fair, if they promote genuine opportunity, if they mitigate extreme hardship. So talk about social justice becomes meaningful for guiding how we design those institutions.
That really sets up the core conflict. Is justice about fair processes and liberty, let the chips fall where they may? Or is it about achieving certain fair outcomes?
That's the crux of it. And this is where John Rawls comes in so centrally. He really tried to give concrete substance to the idea of a just basic structure for society.
Right, with his famous veil of ignorance idea. Designing society without knowing who you'll be.
Precisely. What principles would rational people choose if they didn't know their own race, class, gender, talents? He argued they'd prioritize two things.
Okay, what's the first?
Equal basic rights and liberties for everyone, freedom of speech, conscience, political participation, things like that. This has absolute priority, non-negotiable.
Got it. Freedom first. And the second principle deals with inequality.
Yes. Social and economic inequalities are okay, but only under two conditions. One, they have to be attached to positions open to all under fair equality of opportunity.
So everyone needs a fair shot at the better positions.
Right. And two, this is the famous part, inequalities must work to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society, the difference principle.
So inequality is only justified if it somehow lifts up the people at the bottom.
That's the core idea. Maybe higher pay for some roles incentivizes work that ultimately benefits everyone, especially the worst off. It's not about rewarding merit per se, but about how the system impacts those with the least. Rawls saw this as justice as fairness, a way to reconcile freedom and equality.
A direct answer to the Hayekian view, trying to show you can design institutions for fairness. The sources also bring in gender explicitly. How does feminist philosophy weigh in on social justice?
Feminist thinkers argue forcefully that any theory of justice has to grapple with deep-seated gender inequality. They point to history, denying women votes, property rights, equal pay, things that were legal but are now seen as clearly unjust.
So abstract principles aren't enough. You have to see how they affect real groups.
Absolutely. And they highlight ongoing issues, the pay gap, unequal housework burdens, lack of women in power. Thinkers like Susan Mahler-Okin argued that traditional theories, maybe even early Rawls, ignored the family as a site of injustice.
Which makes sense. If things are unfair at home, how can you have real equality outside it?
Precisely. They push for substantive equality, not just formal legal equality. What good is being free to work if you face bias, lack childcare, or shoulder all the domestic labor?
And intersectionality comes in here too. How different biases overlap.
Yes. Kimberly Crenshaw's work is crucial. You have to see how race, class, gender, disability, etc. interact. And approaches like the capabilities approach from Nussbaum and Sen focus on what people are actually able to do and be. Justice means ensuring everyone has the real freedom, the capabilities, for a flourishing life.
Which might mean needing different resources or support to get to that point.
Exactly. It's about genuine opportunity to thrive.
So social justice is this really broad umbrella, economic, racial, gender, LGBTQ++ disability rights. How society's structure impacts all groups.
It is. And going back to that first question, idea, ideal, process, social justice seems like all three. It's Rawls' ideal structure, Sen's focus on fixing real unfairness, and this constant ongoing struggle.
Okay, let's shift. The sources make a big deal about distinguishing two main types of justice.
Right. The classic split. Distributive and retributive justice.
Distributive is.
Who gets what? How are society's benefits and burdens, wealth, opportunity, jobs, taxes fairly shared out?
And retributive.
That's about responding to wrongdoing. What's a fair punishment? What do people deserve when they break the rules or harm others?
Goes way back, right? Aristotle talked about this.
He did. Distributive justice for shares and corrective or rectificatory justice for fixing wrongs.
Okay, let's dig into distributive a bit more. What principles guide the who gets what decision?
Well, there are several contenders. You could distribute based on merit or desert what people earn or deserve, or based on need. Or strict equality, everyone gets the same.
Or based on what creates the most overall happiness.
Utility.
Exactly. Utilitarianism. Different theories prioritize different principles. Strict egalitarians want equal shares. Utilitarians want maximum total welfare.
And then there are the libertarians like Nozick with a completely different take.
Right. For Nozick, it's not about the final pattern of who has what. It's about how they got it.
The process, not the outcome. Precisely. If you acquired something justly, like homesteading unowned land, or received it through a voluntary transfer, buying, gift, then your holding is just, period, no matter how unequal the overall picture looks.
That's the Wilt-Chamberlain example, right?
Imagine a just starting point, maybe equal shares. People voluntarily pay Wilt-Chamberlain extra to watch him play. He gets way richer. Nozick asks, if every single transaction was voluntary and fair, how can the result be unjust?
Because taxing Wilt to redistribute that wealth would violate his right to what people freely gave him.
Exactly. For Nozick, enforcing any specific pattern, like equality or Rawls' difference principle, requires constantly interfering with people's liberty to do what they want with their own property. That interference is the injustice.
It's a stark contrast. Process-based justice versus outcome-based justice. What about retributive justice punishment?
The core idea here is proportionality. The punishment should fit the crime. It's about accountability for wrongdoing.
Not just an eye for an eye, literally, though.
Usually not. Modern retributivism, influenced by Kant, argues punishment is justified because the offender deserves it for their voluntary wrongful act. It's backward-looking, focused entirely on the past act and the offender's blameworthiness or desert.
Kant's example was pretty extreme. Punish the last murderer, even if society is dissolving.
Yeah, just for justice's sake. Pure desert.
How does that contrast with, say, utilitarian views on punishment?
Utilitarians, like Bentham, are forward-looking. Punishment is justified only by its good future consequences.
Like deterring crime.
Exactly. Deterrence, stopping the offender and others. Incapacitation, protecting society by locking up dangerous people. Or rehabilitation, reforming the offender. Punishment is a tool for social utility.
So one looks back at desert, the other looks forward at consequences. They must conflict sometimes.
They can. A retributivist wouldn't punish someone less than they deserve just to create more deterrence. A utilitarian might theoretically sacrifice strict proportionality for a greater social good, though most add side constraints about rights.
And our actual legal systems seem to blend these.
They definitely try. Sentencing considers the crime's severity, retributive, but also deterrence and rehabilitation, utilitarian. And procedural justice, fair trials, due process is crucial for both. You need fair procedures and substantively fair outcomes, like proportional sentences.
It makes you think of Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, that really cynical view.
Justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger.
Basically, my mate's right. Justice is just what the powerful say it is.
It's the ultimate challenge to the idea that justice has any real moral content. Plato, of course, argued against it, trying to show justice is a genuine virtue, not just power politics.
Because otherwise you can't criticize injustice, you can only describe power struggles.
Precisely. Most philosophy rejects Thrasymachus, arguing justice is meant to constrain power.
So distributive and retributive justice cover sharing fairly and responding fairly to wrongs. And they're interconnected.
Very much so. Unfair distribution might itself be seen as a wrong needing correction. And the system of punishment itself has to be distributed fairly. Are sentences biased based on race or class? That's a distributive failure within the retributive system.
When you hear debates about taxes or sentencing reform, these are the deep questions lurking underneath.
Absolutely. They affect real lives profoundly.
And this brings us to that other huge tangle. Justice, freedom, and equality. How do they fit together?
It's maybe the central balancing act. Justice seems to demand both treating people equally, as moral equals anyway, and respecting their freedom, their liberty.
But they pull against each other, right?
Yeah.
Total freedom can mean huge inequality. Forcing equality can crush freedom.
That's the classic tension. The sources show different philosophies trying to navigate it.
So let's revisit those. Libertarians like Nozick.
For them, freedom, negative liberty, freedom from interference is the top value. Justice is protecting that freedom, especially property rights. Equality only matters as equal basic rights under law. Enforcing equal outcomes is unjust coercion.
Freedom wins, basically. What about egalitarian liberals, like Rawls?
Rawls seeks a balance. Equal basic liberties come first, always. But he argues freedom isn't truly valuable for everyone without a decent level of social and economic equality.
So the difference principle and fair opportunity are needed to make freedom meaningful for the worst off.
Exactly. It's about creating a fair framework for free and equal citizens to cooperate. Equality serves freedom, in a way.
Okay. And utilitarians?
They value freedom and equality primarily as means to the ultimate goal. Maximizing overall happiness or welfare. Freedom is usually crucial for well-being. Equality might be promoted if it increases total happiness.
Like taking $1 from a billionaire and giving it to someone starving increases overall utility.
That's the diminishing marginal utility argument, yeah. But if violating a right or creating inequality somehow led to massively more overall happiness, a pure utilitarian might have to endorse it, which worries critics.
What about socialist or Marxist perspectives?
They argue liberal formal freedom is insufficient. Real freedom requires economic equality. They talk about positive freedom, freedom to achieve things, realize potential. Without material equality, that freedom is just theoretical for many.
So economic equality is seen as the basis for real freedom.
For many in that tradition, yes. From each according to his ability to each according to his need, aims for a radical equality to enable everyone's potential, though historically, attempts to enforce this often came at a high cost to negative liberties.
And feminist and multicultural approaches expand this again.
Definitely. They focus on how systemic inequalities tied to group identity, gender, race, etc., block both freedom and equality. Formal rights aren't enough if you face discrimination or lack basic resources.
Which leads back to things like the capabilities approach.
Exactly. Justice means ensuring everyone has the real capability, the actual freedom to live a minimally flourishing life. This often requires addressing inequalities directly to achieve that substantive freedom for all.
So equality isn't monolithic. It ranges from basic rights to substantive outcomes or capabilities.
Precisely. And it raises that question, is strict equality of outcome even desirable or possible without repression?
Seems unlikely, given human nature and choices.
Right.
And maybe leveling down isn't the goal.
Right. Most agreed justice isn't simple sameness. It requires some equality, moral worth, basic rights, maybe opportunity, but allows some inequality, provided it's justified. The debate is over the justification.
Benefit to the least well-off.
Yeah.
Result of free exchange, increased total welfare.
Those are the competing justifications tied directly to how you balance freedom and equality.
Okay, one last big question the sources raise. Is there an objective standard for justice, or is it all relative?
The perennial question. Historically, many philosophers, Cicero, Aquinas, Locke, Kant, argued yes, based on natural law, reason, universal rights.
The idea that some things are just wrong, everywhere, always, like genocide.
Exactly. Modern human rights discourse builds on this, but then you have the skeptics, the relativists, going back to Thrasymachus, saying justice is just what a particular culture or power structure says it is.
Which makes it hard to criticize other cultures' practices as unjust.
It does. If it's all relative, unjust just means not how we do things. Most find that unsatisfying. The very act of arguing about justice seems to assume there's a better or worse answer, some standard we're appealing to.
So maybe some core objective elements, but lots of debate on the specifics.
That seems to be where much contemporary thought lands. We strive for rational justification, believing some standard exists, even if we argue about its precise content and application.
Okay, wrapping this all up, justice, it's definitely complex.
Yeah.
An idea, an ideal, a process, all of it.
It really is. We covered social justice, that Rawls versus Hayek tension. We unpacked a distributive justice, who gets what, and retributive justice, fair punishment.
And we explored that constant dance between justice, freedom, and equality through different philosophical lenses: libertarian, egalitarian, liberal, utilitarian, socialist, feminist.
And these aren't just academic games. They're responses to real human concerns: poverty, discrimination, crime, abuse of power. Each theory shines a light on different aspects, even when they conflict.
You know, like Lady Justice and her scales. Always trying to find that balance between competing claims, individual and community, freedom and equality.
It's a continuous process of adjustment. And hopefully understanding these different ideas, digging into the sources like we did, gives you, the listener, better tools to analyze the justice debates happening everywhere.
Whether it's about income gaps, criminal justice, human rights, you can hear echoes of these philosophical arguments.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought to take away from this deep dive. If achieving a perfectly just society remains, well, maybe an elusive ideal, what's the most important practical step you think we could take today to reduce injustice in the world we actually live in?